Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, where we have a returning guest, Austin Stout, who's going to be talking to us about the importance of sleep. So a really good discussion to have here, not just for physique development, for everyone in all walks of life. I'm sure you'll agree, Austin.
Yeah, if we look from even just a research perspective, sleep deprivation increases mortality rate in everyone, in all populations, and it increases risk of pretty much every, fatal disease that we commonly see. So it's important.
Yeah, it's I always remember I was thinking before we came on the pod today, before I got into bodybuilding, I always went with the rule of thumb of 8 hours being the ideal amount of sleep. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think there's some factors there. I think that we could probably look at like how demanding is that person's day to day, and that might dictate that number might move a little bit. And some people just frankly feel better with certain amounts of sleep. Like sometimes if you sleep 10 hours, you might feel worse the next day, right? You feel
Yeah.
groggy. So for example, there's a happy medium, but I would say it's pretty well established that probably somewhere in like that 7 to 9 hour range is pretty good for the most part.
Yeah, and of course, everyone has different sleep quality, don't they? And there's so many things we can discuss with supplements, with setup, routine, everything that goes into sleep. And it's definitely something I prioritize myself, especially in a prep. It really does start to deteriorate, the deficit grows, and you start to feel that so much more, that sort of insomnia type of sleep. And I don't know if you get that when you're dieting as well.
Yeah, so that's another good little segue is how do we really quantify sleep? Do we just look at hours, right? Or do we look at quality of sleep? Because we could argue that seven, high quality hours of sleep would be better than maybe nine poor, quality hours of sleep. So those things need to be taken into consideration as well. Um, so there's some things when you diet or when you get really lean, especially there's what your body's really trying to do is become more efficient, right? Because it doesn't really like what's going on. So, and we see efficiency in a lot of ways, right? We see efficiency in like metabolic rate, right? For example, like our thyroid the conversion of thyroid hormone may slow down a little bit. We see that, like sex hormones can be affected. So we're really trying to be efficient and conserve
Mm.
energy in every way. So over to the sleep, some people notice that they may need a little bit less sleep at times during the prep, but also that gets kind of tricky because there's also that point way later in prep or in a diet where the sleep quality starts to suffer. So you feel like no matter what you do, you're tired, right? um, yeah, and those are things that I'm looking at in client feedback. I mean, it might just even be a new client coming in. They're like, hey, I sleep 8 hours a night, but I'm getting up 8 times,
Yeah.
right? So those things are, I mean, that's a huge difference between sleeping 7 hours straight through,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because as well in the sport of bodybuilding or in any sport, I'd imagine, fluid intake is quite high. And something I try and do is cut off when I have my fluids. So sort of 6, 7 p.m., I start to round that off and just sip on water if I need it to first. But I used to sort of drink so much water throughout the day that I'd be up just going for a pee in the night.
Yeah, it's a little harder, especially when you're lean, right? Because your fluid retention is lower because your adipose tissue, it's like shrinking down, and it's harder to hold it. During the day, you're peeing constantly, type of thing. So yeah, making sure that you have sufficient electrolytes and stuff coming in too. If you're losing more water, you may making sure that you have sufficient sodium, potassium, etc. Cutting off the water a little bit earlier before bedtime. I think a lot of people might get afraid of that, but if you've been drinking water all day, you're plenty hydrated to taper it off at night. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, for sure. Because it can go pretty high for competitors. You know, in my the last show that I did on the peak, I was up to like 6 liters, and that was graduated up from 4. And it's 2 liters is so much more, but then to try and cut it off, you're trying to fight to get the fluid in earlier in the day, and it's like this whole
Sure,
thing.
sure. Yeah, so those are things that maybe competitive, maybe that's kind of a pretty specific situation, right? Like that's prep and lean, but I don't think, but most people aren't living in that state most of the time. So I guess what we could, talk about is like what does the sleep look like the other 80% of our life, when off season, general population, those types of things. Um, so first off, we have different stages of sleep, right? People that are familiar with like using tracking devices like Aura Ring or Whoop bands, things like that, or Fitbits, whatever, Apple Watch, they do track. They track, different parameters, whether it be deep sleep, time, time in deep sleep, time in REM sleep, latency. Some of the apps will track sleep latency, like how long does it take you to fall asleep, type of thing. Um, Also, maybe tracking like disturbances, like waking up and stuff. And of course, it's the validity of some of that's tricky because like moving around in your sleep or something could potentially trigger, it could say a wake up even though maybe you didn't wake up, type of thing.
Mhm.
So those those tools are okay. I would say though, I use them I use them less in my more objective clients, the ones that are able to more give me better objective feedback, because I don't think that we need to rely on that as much. We can get better feedback through our how we feel versus using those numbers, which can vary and maybe not be accurate. But those things might be better used in people that are horrible at giving objective feedback and really need some kind of parameter to look at, right?
When I started tracking sleep back in the day, it became this. I remember we said this on the last pod. If you start to monitor data too much, you become this neurotic robot and you think, well, I haven't had enough sleep, but you feel all right. But then your REM sleep was down that night, and then you start getting into this whole brain warp.
Right. So those that can become tricky. That wasn't really where I was going with the topic, but yeah, I mean that's super important. We talked about that with the last podcast that we did, and that's any data. That's
Yeah.
blood glucose. That's HRV. Like any of that stuff can become obsessive and neurotic. But so we have those stages of sleep, and within those there's different kind of like sub stages, which we don't have to go too far into that, but essentially, you have REM sleep, which tends to be a little more like brain restorative, and then deep sleep tends to be a little more like body restorative. That's kind of the easiest way to think about it, and that's a broad generalization, but we want both, right?
Yep.
So we need both types of sleep. We also need, we're also like looking at, like I said, sleep latency. So when I have someone that has a sleep issue, it's normally one of two things, or maybe both. It's either A, they can't fall asleep, right? Because anxiety or they're whatever, right? Or they can't stay asleep, or maybe both.
Mm.
Hopefully not both.
Yeah.
But there's different reasons as to why we would maybe see those two things happen. One would be the most basic thing that we talk about, and most people within the industry are pretty keen to now, which is just sleep hygiene, right? It's just like what are you doing before you go to bed, maybe in that 1 to 2 hours window before bedtime.
Mm.
uh, but the basics which we don't have to spend a lot of time on, because again, a lot of people know, is like artificial light, like if you are using screens, making sure you're using like blue light blocking glasses, or almost all the phones and things now have like a setting on there that will a screen an eye protective setting, so making sure you're using that. Making sure that maybe if you are using a laptop, like I like to use the Flux. It's called Flux. It's on, I think it's free. It used to be free. I don't know if it's still free. And that's just basically like a blue light blocking. It's like a nighttime mode where your screen will basically it's looks red or orange, right? So it's emitting less of that blue light. So like things like that are great.
Yeah.
Uh, Household lighting. This so I like to use blue blockers regardless, but you can limit, you know, the artificial light in the house pretty easily too. Like I pretty much have my new house has these and has these like they run along the sides of the ceiling, which are like a mood light. It's like a really dull light, right?
Oh, cool.
So it's not very bright. So those are nice to have. Those are nice to have instead of our modern bulbs are emitting a lot, right? Modern lighting is emitting a lot. So those are really nice to have. Candles are great. You can, you know, you can light a handful of candles within, the hour before bed, do whatever tasks you need to do if you're preparing food for the next day, or if you're just sitting down, you're reading a book or I don't know, whatever you like to do.
Mm.
Though that's helpful. That's kind of been my routine is just maybe within an hour before bed. It's candlelight or those dull mood lights, blue light blockers on. Don't do anything too stimulating. If you are using a screen, or if you're someone that's like watching TV or something with your blue light blockers on, try not to watch like an action film before you go to bed. Maybe that's not a good
I've
idea.
done
you
that.
know, probably don't play Call of Duty before you go to bed. So like stuff like that. Like if you are going to do those things, maybe save at least 30 to 60 minutes afterwards before you try to go to sleep, right?
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
because I understand we can set up this perfect nighttime routine where you're like meditate before you go to bed and do all this shit. It's like, well, a lot of people aren't going to do that.
Yeah. How
So we
realistic
have
is
to kind
it
of
for
take
people?
right. It's a practicality thing. It's like try to kind of take what you're already doing and just make it a little bit better, right? Um, so that's nighttime routine, and you can add in extra things would be like again doing some soft belly breathing, or if you like to do meditation, or if you like to read, like literally anything that relaxes you is helpful. Anything doesn't
Yeah.
really matter what it is. Like if it relaxes you, it's probably going to help you sleep, right? If it
I-
if it takes your mind off of the things that keep you awake,
Mm.
it's going to help you sleep.
Yeah.
So that's anything really. It doesn't have to be one specific modality, right?
Yeah. I think it sets the tone as well, doesn't it? I always find that, like you say, about an hour before bed, if you can dim the light in, if you're going to watch TV, put something a bit more passive on, or do some yoga, something like this, your body starts to think, okay, so it's time to start winding down. And then you get used to doing that routine. I remember when I first started to implement this sort of routine, I used to almost fight it because I thought, but I want to be doing things.
Right.
And then it's hard to switch the mind off, and then you're in bed and your mind's still going everywhere.
Right. And it's interesting when you get really good at it. Well, and this will put us into probably the second part of this topic, which is like your circadian, your pattern, right? Or your rhythm.
Mm.
So it's funny, like let's say you do this Monday through Friday. On a Saturday, you go out with your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, friends, whatever, in an evening, and it's 10:30 and you're out and you're like, right,
Yes.
right. No matter what you're doing, it doesn't even matter, right? And that's happening because that circadian pattern is it's set and such that it's like melatonin is being dumped, and you know um your more sedative type of neurochemicals, GABA, serotonin, things like that they're so regulated that they're like, hey, guess what? It's bedtime.
Yeah.
So, and you can like get a set, you can, if you get past it, you can get that little bit of a second wave if you're going to stay out a little longer or whatever. But you'll notice that you're very well regulated, right?
Mm.
So waking, and this brings us into like daytime. So it's not just our nighttime routine, it's also having a good waking routine and a good daytime routine. So waking up and going to bed at similar times every day is a really great way to regulate sleep, right?
Mm.
It's a really easy thing to do because most people do the same types of things every day anyhow, right?
Yeah.
So having a pretty set wake time and sleep time, even on the weekends, is helpful. That's going to help regulate when those excitatory waking response in the morning, which is like cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, adrenaline, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at night, you're getting the opposite effect, melatonin release, etc. So that's a super easy thing that most people are going to probably need to do anyhow because they have jobs and routines and things like that. So those are all pretty much free and easy, things that people can do. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of the time is we have these things established, but we're still having sleep issues. So let's kind of talk about that,
Yeah, for sure.
because this is where we have to kind of think about those patterns are disrupted for some reason. So I'll give some examples. And I see this a lot. I do that, the Dutch testing, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things it shows on there is it has a 4-point cortisol, and they also give you the optional nighttime nocturnal cortisol. If you wake up in the middle of the night, there's like you can get a reading then.
Mm.
So what happens is we have, disruptions in that rhythm, and there's a lot of things that can cause it. Common ones would just be not having a good sleep wake time. That's one. Shift work, that would be another one. That's a rough one.
Yeah.
With shift work. So what it looks like on the test, if anyone's, for those of you that haven't seen it, it's like there's number readings and stuff, but there's actually a line graph that goes up and down, right? That's what it should do. You should have a waking response, and then it should taper off, and it should be low at nighttime, and that's kind of what it should look like.
Yeah.
But you can see a whole variety of patterns. So people that are extremely stressed, that are very in that excitatory kind of sympathetic nervous system state all the time, they might just be like high across the board all the time.
Yeah.
Or if they have got to that state of like full adrenal burnout or insufficiency, they might actually just be low the whole time, right? So they don't have any waking response. They're just tired the whole day,
Yeah.
nonstop.
Mm.
Or perhaps we see the shift worker or someone that stays up too late or whatever, and they have maybe like a flip-flop pattern where they are higher at night and lower in the morning, or something, or some variation of that. So it's like you get up and you're tired, but then when it's time to go to bed, you're awake.
Yeah. It's such a
That's
bizarre
not
feeling,
ideal.
that. Mm.
That is not ideal. Um, and there's other things like training, perhaps. Like I really try to have my clients avoid training super close to bedtime if they can.
Mm.
For I understand that scheduling, it's not always possible, but if you train at 8 p.m. and you go to bed at 10 p.m., you might have some issues there, because you're going to be, even if you're tired from completing your training session, you're in that sympathetic state. You're not, the neurochemicals are not being released that should be. It's a bad situation.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of things that can flip that pattern around. But beyond that, just total stress load is going to make that pattern irregular. Once it gets out of whack, it can take a while to get it back on track. I mean, you can have like a common thing that people would notice is like they wake up in the middle of the night and they're alert. They're like, it's 2 a.m. or something, I don't, whatever time it is. And they wake up and they're like, I'm alert, right?
Yeah.
Or they're kind of bumpy throughout the night, and their cortisol dips, and their blood sugar in turn drops, and they wake up and they're hungry and they're alert, right?
Mm.
So when we get to that point, when I'm like, okay, well, sleep routine's pretty good,
Yeah.
we're doing the right things, but you're having all these, these like funky wake ups, or you're tired at times that you really shouldn't be.
Mm.
then we're looking at just total systemic stress load over time, right?
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? Because sometimes I work with individuals that they don't think they're stressed, but they admit they've got lots of workload, but they say they enjoy their job and what have you. And they're not realizing that that is still a stressor. And when you're working on lots of different projects, or, you know, you've got a busy lifestyle with these types of things, it can be really hard to then switch off at night. But it's trying to almost flip it around and help people understand that, you know, you do need to switch off from things like work, but people are busy, aren't they?
Yeah, you're right. So there's some trade-off there. You have to figure out. It's taken me a long time to learn because my schedule is very demanding, and it's there's a lot of times where I'm working, you know, up until close to bedtime,
Yeah,
right? And that's just kind of the reality of it. So that nighttime routine has to be really nailed down, and and as long as I do that, I'm good. I will. My sleep latency is short. I fall asleep immediately,
I
right?
love
Like
that.
yeah, I am done. I am out. And when you get good at the lighting component and the relaxation component, you get really tired. So the last thing you want to do is try to go lay down in bed when you're not tired. It's not going to work,
No.
right? You need to be tired and ready to sleep before you attempt to sleep.
Mm.
So like last night, for example, this week's been just like most weeks, but this one especially, for whatever reason, has just been like extra crazy. So last night I sat down, did my routine, had my blue light blockers on, lights dim, etc. I was so tired. I mean, I just fell asleep on the couch, you know. So as soon as I got back up, I got ready for bed and I fell asleep immediately, right? But that's because I've trained my rhythm to be so regulated over time that I can afford to have those days like that because my body's like, hey, it's still bedtime regardless,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. It's training
So
yourself almost, isn't it? Because when you mentioned earlier about some people wake up hungry because things are out of whack across different things in life, you know, when it relates to being in a diet, when I first started doing preps, I'd wake up and I'd focus on being hungry, and then I couldn't switch off from that. Whereas now I know what that feels like, and I don't ever wake up and think, oh, I could go and eat something now, because I've trained myself to, I've experienced it and I know that sleep's important, and I just try and take that time to lay there and rest.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So understanding the variables and why you feel certain ways is going to be helpful for sure. Another thing we could probably talk about is supplementation and medication too.
Yeah, great idea.
So we'll talk about medications first because there are a lot of different things that people will do that when they have, a trouble sleeping to try to sleep, that's pharmaceutical, right?
Mm.
So non prescription methods, and this could be prescription depending on where you live, would be like THC, right? So what generally happens with most, and I can kind of lump most medications into this. What most of these medications do are they calm you down. They sedate you in a way.
Mm.
So people mistake this making me tired so I can fall asleep with better sleep quality, right? And what we really see in research, and what we even see it on like those data trackers and stuff like the Aura Ring, for example, is yes, they will make you tired. Why? Because they generally take the anxiety away, right?
Yeah.
Because now you're not thinking about the things that are keeping you awake.
Mm.
But they will worsen sleep quality when compared to getting good sleep without them, right? Like it's like if you took the same people and used it in one and not in the other, we generally have better sleep quality without it if they can fall asleep. The so it's probably better than not sleeping at all, right?
Mm.
But it's not better than improving why you can't fall asleep in the first place, I guess is the point.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of drug classes. I mean, you, benzos, right? Things like so GABAergic drugs like a Xanax or stuff like that. THC, which can be, there's a lot of strands of it. I'm not an expert on it, but there's different strands that can be maybe a little more stimulatory, a little more relaxing.
Mm.
Serotonin, like serotonin based drugs that like SSRIs and things like that people might use, which are really antidepressants, right? But they could make you tired,
Mm.
right? So all these things just really make you tired is what they do. They make you less anxious and they make you tired. So in return, you fall asleep easier.
Yeah.
So I don't like using things like that with people. It's not something that I recommend with clients. I really would much rather find why they can't sleep. And I have more than a handful of examples of people that were like really chronic marijuana users and stuff before bed.
Yeah.
And when we kind of fit, because it's very common, right? Extremely common. When we fixed their routine overall and they stopped using it, their sleep quality was way better than when they were using it. Right.
Mm.
So, and you're going to see people that they'll fight me to the death on that one, but that's okay. I'm just saying from anecdotal evidence and like data that I've seen with, trackers and things like that, you will have better sleep quality without them if you do the right things. So
Yeah, it relates to alcohol as well, doesn't it? Some people say, "Oh, I was flat out because I went out and had alcohol," but the sleep is so disturbed and they feel terrible the next day.
right. Yeah. And there's some things will even give you like that like a hangover effect. I mean, alcohol does, right? It'll give you, like a hangover or groggy effect the next day. There's some other off-label things like like mood stabilizing drugs like antipsychotics, like Seroquel is one. Some different things that they will put you out, but you kind of feel off the next day,
Yeah.
right? And then there's other like more dedicated sleep medications like Ambien and different things like that. But again, it's kind of the same outcome when we look at the data.
Yeah.
So, and like dependency and addiction and all kinds of stuff comes into play there too. So that's a whole different story. So I'm not saying I'm necessarily against people using substances that alter their neurochemicals, whether it be, marijuana or caffeine or stimulants or whatever, but it's just knowing how to apply them, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So over the counter, you can do, there's a couple things like, melatonin. So melatonin is definitely probably going to improve the actual quality of sleep and keeping you asleep if you're deficient. You produce melatonin endogenously. It is a hormone. So if you are doing the proper things at night, like we talked about, you're going to produce your own melatonin, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's a lot of where the whole blue light blocking came into play, because they were seeing that artificial light exposure, especially that particular spectrum of light, was depleting or slowing down melatonin production at night, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they found if you wear these glasses or you don't look at the screens or you use the apps or whatever, that you were seeing increased levels. So that was helpful. You could supplement with it. There's a lot of schools of thought on that. It doesn't take much melatonin to increase your serum melatonin levels like up to where you would normally produce it. It takes very, very little, like half a milligram, 1 milligram would put you pretty high. However, there's some other potential benefits like anti-cancer, anti-carcinogenic type benefits and stuff at higher doses. So I'm not recommending that people do that necessarily. You can try it. the biggest thing with the higher doses is you got to kind of see like how much can you take before you feel hungover the next day type of
Yeah,
thing.
sure. Yeah.
So you want to be careful with it. I mean, you get people going up. I've seen like 60, 80 milligrams, like some super high doses. So it'll be person dependent. That's something that if you wanted to do it, you'd probably want to kind of like titrate up to see where that threshold is for you.
Mm.
And then more calming would be like something more GABAergic, like theanine. I really like that will potentially increase serum GABA levels. It crosses the blood-brain barrier really good. You can use GABA supplement by itself. It'll help. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier as well, but it will help some. So those two things, that's very calming. Serotonin's a tricky one. Like you can, like 5-HTP will be a precursor. It'll help raise serotonin. It's going to do one of two things. It's either going to make you calm or it's going to make you too alert. So that's something that you'd have to try it and find out. If you were going to do it, you'd probably want to do like 50 to 100 milligrams at first to kind of assess it, and then maybe go up to 200 or 300 if you wanted to try more. Theanine's pretty similar dosing, probably anywhere from like 100 to 300. It's kind of standard with that. And there's others. I mean, there's other calming type of supplements, but they're normally doing one of two things, or a few different mechanisms. They're either like they're either like increasing their GABAergic, so they act at the GABA receptor, they're act at the serotonin receptor, or they somehow are depressing excitatory neurotransmitters, like they're lowering dopamine response or they're calming your nervous system. So those are kind of like the mechanisms that would maybe calm you down at night.
Yeah. Do you find that if you have people come on board as clients and they're already using prescription or some of the supplements you just spoke about, that if you're going to try and transition, and you've got to explain the process, and you, like you say, sort of wean people off of certain things?
Yeah. So just like any medication, for one, I always tell people I'm not a doctor. So if you're prescribed something, here's what I do. Like, I'm going to tell you, here's the mechanism, right? Like this is what's happening. This is how we can improve it. If we get everything in place that will support the normal rhythm, then you can decide if you want to stop the medications. And a lot of the time people are for that. Like they want to do that anyhow. They just don't know how, right?
Yeah.
Like they're like, well, I don't really want to have to take this sleep medication forever. Most people don't. They just don't really, they're just afraid to not take it because they know what their sleep quality was, or their sleep was so bad before they took it that they're nervous to stop. Right. So I'm not going to say like, hey, stop taking your meds. It's more like, let's fix all of this and then you can stop if you'd like to, type of thing. Right. And it's always, and I always try to present things as, this is what's okay, but this is like what's optimal. Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. If you can educate people as well, I definitely find that it helps. And like you say, when you put things in place and then if it works, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then they're coming away from, because you get married to certain, I guess, principles and protocols, and especially in bodybuilding, there's so many different avenues you can take with all of what we do. There's a lot of people that are so married to one idea that it's very hard to gravitate to another. But if you can give that tuition, I find that it really does help.
sure. Yeah. And again, like I'm the way that, and this isn't necessarily just sleep related, but the way that I coach people and talk to people is it's all logic based. Like I try to make things as simple and logical as possible. That way it makes so much sense that I don't have to make any decisions for them. They're like, well, of course, like, of course that's what I want to do. Right. It's like, it makes that choice very, very easy. Now, the process leading up to it might take some time, but But again, like it doesn't have to be complicated. So another thing that we touch on a little bit too would just be like, so what happens if we're doing all the things right and they're not, there's still disturbances. We talked about like total stress loads. Like what are other things that we have to look at? Well, we have to look at, cumulative stress, like what are all the things contributing? Their environment, their job, their family, their relationships, their training. We really have to figure out where can we most easily reduce or pull from that stress bucket? Like what are the things that we can do right off the bat? Maybe it's not possible to quit their job. Okay.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
Maybe that's not going to happen. Right. So like, what are other things that we can do to make immediate improvements? The most immediate improvements we can normally make as coaches outside of sleep routine, which we can all improve, is usually training and activity level, right? Like cardio, training more so because we know training is going to be a lot more nervous system intensive than like walking outside,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
However, if I have someone that's doing like 25,000 steps a day, super obsessively, and like pacing around their living room to get their steps in at night, that's a behavior that's probably not helping. So so yes, like cardio and things could definitely come into it, especially if they're doing like higher intensity intervals and stuff like that. But training's probably the easiest one. And sometimes it's, sometimes that's a reduction in total training load. Sometimes it's like reduction in, you know, intensity, like proximity to failure within the training, even though we're not reducing how much we're actually doing. It's like we're just not killing ourselves on every set type thing. So there's a lot of ways that we can lower that total stress load. So if I get, brand new client that comes in, those are the things that I'm looking at. It's like, okay, how much are you doing? How good is the routine? What can we fix? That's quickest and easiest, because it's also a lot easier for, to get adherence when people are see things working,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So I don't want to say that like instant gratification is the goal, because obviously most of these processes are not acute. They take time, but it is always nice when you can make some immediate improvement, even if you can notice it. If you notice something working, you're much more likely to continue to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's a slightly different subject, but deloads, I know a variety of different people that approach it differently. And, if you're on a progressive meso and then you've got a scheduled deload, some people I know will take the whole week off from the gym and just do their steps and the other things that contribute. And others will go in and do a couple of light pump sessions. But if you are really overreached and you get to that deload point, sometimes it really does just help reset things, and then you can get back into your second meso and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, and we talked about that. But I did a training podcast a little bit ago today, actually. So we talked about that. When you see those things, you that's kind of, hey, deload time, right? So you're at your peak workload. You're starting to overreach. It becomes a question of like, how much are you overreached and how much rest do you need? So if I'm already working with the client and I'm controlling those things, then we don't really need to do anything too extreme. It might just be, we might just bring down volume for a week or whatever, and that's sufficient. If I have a brand new client that's coming in that's so far overreached that, we're talking about like their functionality in general is just way off, then that's where we're talking about like not going to the gym or taking all of their training load down. So
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, like I work with a lot of these functional health cases and stuff. And one of the things that we unfortunately have to do with a lot of people is training can be limited to like 2 or 3 days a week with a lot of these people. And sometimes there's even extreme cases where it's like we have to just come out of the gym for a period of time because they're not, well, for one, they're not getting anywhere. The training's not doing anything good for them. It's just making things worse. So it's
Mm,
not like they're going to regress if they stop training, because they're already regressing.
mm,
So, uh, so there's a lot of levels to like deloading and resting.
mm.
But I guess my point is that if you don't dig yourself in too much of a hole, then the deload process doesn't really need to be that extensive, right? You don't, it's not like you need to not train for 3 weeks or a month or something. Like, you don't have to do that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And it's so person dependent, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
Mm.
And like psychology and stuff plays into it too. Like some people, the idea of doing a deload week where we reduce volume and proximity to failure, they're like, they don't do well with it because they want to just go in and beat themselves up.
Yeah.
So maybe I just need to keep them out of the gym. Maybe a better option is just say, we're just going to do 5 to 7 days in a row, back to back, of just no training. Not in reality, like nothing. The only thing that's going to happen in that amount of time is you might lose a little bit of, you know, glycogen storage, just because you're not like partitioning into the muscles because you're not training them or something. But it's so minimal that the first day or two that you're back to training, it's going to be exactly where you were. You'll be fine.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure. It's more psychological a lot of the time, isn't it? We all like to get a pump, and when you have that week away from the gym, you're thinking, "Oh my God!" And then, like you say, especially if you've restored yourself, and if you're going to have a week off the gym, you can go for some long walks or do some different stuff, activity-based stuff that we don't maybe get the opportunity to do, and then you can go back fresh to the gym. Because I know when I'm overreached, it definitely affects my sleep.
oh, for sure. Yeah, and those are things that I'm looking at. Sleep is a great parameter to look at in terms of you know stress and recovery. In prep, it's another really good one to look at. I can see. I used to, and this is something that took me a really long time to learn as a coach, but just like paying attention. We'll say this. So instead of just like refeeding people with like lots of food during periods, I like to reduce activity now more so than give lots of food. Maybe I'll do some combination of both, right? But like I would rather do an activity reduction in prep a lot of the time, because, well, what's that going to do? It's going to reduce expenditure, so you're getting that flux and calorie balance still, but it's also going to reduce stress at the same time. So you get kind of a twofold benefit with
Mm.
those, with that. Like I did that last week. I was traveling, and I was getting overreached. I'd been in a deficit for a long time, and I was traveling. It's like, it's great. I'm in a different place. I'm busy. This is where I took, I trained 3 days in the weeks, which was reduced volume, right? And the days that I did train were reduced like, intensity across the board. So it was a good time for me to do that. And of course, when I came back, my training sessions this week have been productive so far. So, it was a good use of my time.
Mm.
Now, it's easy for me to stay out of the gym now because I've done it. I'm just doing this for a long time, but also I'm so busy that it's just like I have plenty of stuff I can do
Yes.
in that hour, 2 hours. Like there's so many things that I can get done that I'm not gonna miss it, you
Yeah.
know. So, but again, like I understand that that's going to be different from person to person. So we have to take the mindset piece into account for sure.
Yeah, and I find that I actually look forward to deloads now, whereas when I first got into bodybuilding, it was like, oh, I can't be away from the gym. And actually, I feel more tired in a deload week. And, sometimes I've actually taken myself off for a nap, which is very unlike me. And, it's the body's way of saying, okay, can you just give me a break for a moment, and then you can restore and go back.
Right. Yeah.
Mm.
I always, one of the funny things that what I hear is, we talk about stress reduction and stuff as well. Training is my stress reliever. Like,
Yeah.
well,
I
I'm like,
take it out on the
that's
weights.
not exactly, yeah. That's like saying, well, I mean, and this is, I mean, I guess slightly off topic, but we've covered most things by now, but what is a non weight training general population person do on the weekends when they're not working? What do?
Mm,
Drink,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
Stay up late, right? Like all these things that are not conducive to stress relief, even though in the moment they're having fun,
Yeah.
right? They're having fun and they're enjoying themselves. So at the time, it's definitely perceived as stress reduction. And maybe it is to an extent. It just depends on like how much off track are you getting on that routine. That's and that's why probably a lot of people even become dependent on certain activities and chemicals and alcohol and things like that in general. Is just like it elicits a response that makes them not think about other stuff,
Mm,
right?
for sure. I thought straight away there, actually, talking about digestion and different foods that you might experience, say if you were going out at the weekend. I always remember when I used to have foods like if I had a Chinese takeaway, I would have a terrible night's sleep because it would be of an evening, and then the next day I'd almost get that effect of like the prescription medication. I'd feel wiped out, very low on energy. And there's different things to think about when it comes to food as well, isn't there? If you're having different foods, that can then affect sleep and affect your mood, and then consequently that can lead on to several days of not feeling yourself and choosing different foods that you wouldn't normally have, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. There's not eating like ridiculously huge boluses of food right before you sleep. Stuff like that can probably improve sleep quality. I don't think it's necessarily. I'm not someone that says you can't eat before bed, but I don't think that you should. I don't think that you should like eat 75% of your calories for the day before bed type of thing.
Yeah, I'm with
It
you
can
on that.
definitely. Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
well, why? Because for one, you feel full and you're not worried about like binging and overeating and stuff because you've ate. So I understand the premise of it. And I used to do that myself too. I would just be like, oh, eat big meal, lots of carbohydrates, stuff before bed, right?
Mm.
And it will potentially make you tired, but it's not right. But
Not
it's
the
not
right
necessarily
way.
right. It's not necessarily improving sleep quality.
Mm.
So but that's also a circadian rhythm thing. Meal times are circadian driven, right? Like let's say if I eat at 10 a.m. every day and then one day I don't eat at 10 a.m., I'm still gonna get hungry at 10 a.m.
Yes, yeah. Particularly, I know
Right?
that a lot in prep. My meals are pretty much exactly the same time every day, and that works extremely well for me.
Right. And so you can just like the people that feel like, well, I have to eat right before bed because it helps me sleep. You can also retrain yourself to not eat before bed, or maybe eat a more reasonable amount of food at that time. Because in prep, I normally do that. I normally do eat a little closer to bedtime in prep.
Yeah,
My
me.
meals are smaller for
Yeah.
one. Like it's a lot less calories in
Yeah.
general. So it's not right. It's not so much of an issue. So I might eat within, I probably ate like an hour before bed, give or take. Whereas in off season, maybe it's a little bit sooner than that, but the meals are also bigger,
Mm.
right? So there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but don't right like don't necessarily cram yourself full of your, almost all of your calories for the day before bed.
Mm.
Not a good idea.
No, something that I would like to pick your brains on a little bit before we wrap up today, Austin, is it's probably come on my radar a little bit more since going down the assisted route as an athlete with sleep apnea, especially in off season. I've noticed it more in males, when that starts to creep in, when the off season, obviously weight's going up, food's going up, and that can affect people a lot more at that stage.
Yeah, so there's different reasons you would have sleep apnea. It's Some of it is like body weight related, musculature in in the neck and the size of that area for the obstruction, right? Like
Yeah.
obstructive, hence the name obstructive sleep apnea. But there is also there's also the component of how you function overall will increase your risk of apnea. So like I have people that are maybe had apnea, but we improve all of those areas that we've just been talking about, and their apnea goes way down at
Okay.
that point.
Mm.
Yeah, and but in general, like yeah, if you lose weight, you're gonna have less apnea. If you gain weight, you're gonna have more chance of apnea. And that's just kind of that's kind of across the board. Like I don't I know I had done a test a couple years ago, and I had I get like mild apnea at a heavy body weight.
Yeah.
Not bad, not bad at all, but mild. I don't have any when I'm leaner and lighter.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean those things play into it, but you can have apnea if you're a 120-pound woman. Like you can still have it. It's just, it's just not generally driven by weight. And of
Mm.
course there's other factors that come into it, even things like how you sleep. If you're like a back sleeper or something, and you have obstruction because of positioning and things like that.
Yeah.
In which we didn't even talk about at all, but just being comfortable in your sleeping environment is super important. Like if you're a muscular person and you sleep on your side, for example, like if you have wide shoulders and you sleep on your side, you need a pillow that's probably tall enough to that you're not, sleeping like this the whole night, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Comfortable pillow, nice, comfortable bedding, right? Like sheets and things that are nice. So one of the things that we've done is over time we've kind of just purchased, nicer bedding. So like higher thread count sheets or satin sheets, stuff like that. That's like cooling, so that all of that will help. There's other options you can use, especially if you're heavier and your food's high and you're sweating a lot. You can do. I don't need it now. It's not as bad, but in the off season I'll use. It's called a bed jet. It's literally a thing that sticks under my bed. There's a piece that comes out and it shoots cool air under my sheet
No
on my
way.
side. Helps a ton, right? So I use that, as I get heavier, I'll use that all the time. There's a chili pad, which is literally just like a pad that you lie on that you could adjust temperature. Some of the really high end beds, like some of the really expensive mattresses will have temperature control. If both of you and, if you have two people sleeping in the same room and they're both hot sleepers, just cool the room temperature down. I know we do that here. Luckily, my wife sleeps hot too. So we would even have, yeah, in the wintertime. It's funny because in the wintertime, we would even like crack our windows in the bedroom, keep the door shut, crack the windows in the bedroom. So it's like, 10, 15 degrees cooler in the bedroom than in the rest of the house. And that's great for sleeping environment. So just being comfortable is super important for sleep, everything, mattresses, bedding, all of it.
It's definitely understated at times, isn't it? A lot of people say, I'm not paying that for a bed, but because I've got one of the mattresses that has the thermocooling system in it.
Yeah.
And it was expensive, but I was like, how long over my lifetime am I in bed? And this mattress is going to last 10 years.
Yeah. They'll spend all kinds of money on clothing and things like that don't really enhance anything.
Yeah.
Right. But other than their perception of how cool they are. And then but their sleep and things like that will suffer. So
yeah, it's like dedicating time to a sleep routine and learning about sleep. I think it should be just as important as your training sessions and everything else that goes into, if you're going down the route of physique development.
Absolutely. Agreed.
So important. Well, thank you for coming on today. I'm sure that the listeners are going to find this super useful. And as always, they can head over to your Instagram if they want any more information on you. So it's Austin, is it 8?
No, it's Austin ST8. Yes.
So if anyone wants to follow Austin's own journey as he's going into are you prepping for a show, Austin?
Yes. So I have I've narrowed it down between some dates. So I'm going to pull the trigger on one of those once I book the hotel and stuff. I'm locked in, right? So you got
Let's get like that. It's like, am I feeling ready? Okay, that's the show.
Yeah,
And then
So
if anyone wants to reach out for coaching inquiries and things like this, is Instagram the best place?
So email's probably best, because a lot of times I'll have to send consultation forms and stuff like that. But my email address is in my bio. So you'll see it there. Just shoot me an email. I can get you set up pretty quickly.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. I wish you well with the rest of your diet. We're on the
Thank
prep
you.
life and
Yes.
hopefully I'll get you back on soon. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
See you later.